Welcome, everyone, to April's first Friday. It's so great to see so many familiar faces, some new faces. My name is Janice Caillet. I'm the president here at Corentus, and I'm thrilled that you are all joining us. And I'm thrilled to have our thought leader, Colin Fisher, with us. So I am thrilled to introduce our first Friday with a thought leader, Colin Fisher. Colin is a professor, speaker, and author of the new book, The Collective Edge, Unlocking the Secret Power of Groups. So he is definitely one of us. He is also an occasional jazz trumpet player. So before academia, he was a longtime member of an orchestra touring extensively and recording several critically acclaimed albums. He studied jazz trumpet at the New England Conservatory of Music and improvisation in the arts at NYU before earning his Ph.D. in organizational behavior at Harvard under the mentorship of Richard Hackman and Ruth Wageman, people who we know very well in this community. He is associate professor and Ph.D. program director at University College London School of Management, their MBA program. His research on group dynamics, creativity, improvisation, and leadership has been published in the field's top academic journals and featured publications such as Harvard Business Review, The Economist, Financial Times, Forbes, NPR, BBC, and many more. His book, The Collective Edge, is published by Avery Penguin Random House and has already been translated into 12 languages, and it just came out in September. For those of you who know and love Hackman and Wageman's work, Colin is carrying that legacy forward in really exciting ways. I'm personally very excited to have Colin with us today as our thought leader. Colin, the stage is yours, my friend.
Thanks so much, Janice. I appreciate that lovely introduction and a lot of things that now I don't have to say about that. So let me get this up. Can everyone see this okay?
Yep. Absolutely.
Yep, great. All right. So as Janice was saying, I just came out with this book, The Collective Edge, and for this audience where you have some familiarity with Hackman and Wageman, in a way, I think this book is almost like a tribute album to Richard and Ruth's work and an updating of this, and also to kind of broaden out from a purely managerial perspective to a broader life perspective. So when I was pitching this to especially people who knew about Richard's work, I would say it's like if we took his book Leading Teams, updated it, and then said, what if we asked that not just about work teams, but about life, about everything? And that I came to write this book not because I was looking to write a book, but actually it felt more like the world was asking me to write the book. So what happened was in the UK, so where I'm based in London now, but you can probably hear I am not a native of London, there was a political scandal going on with the word groupthink being thrown around. So Boris Johnson's government after COVID, one of the ministers left, and the media was talking a lot about groupthink. And so a journalist reached out to me and said, hey, you're a professor at a big university who studies groups. What do we know about groupthink and what can we do about it? And this is something I teach about all the time. So I wrote a quick explainer, didn't think this would be a major moment in my life at all to write this. But then a literary agent reached out to me and said, hey, I really like how you explain that stuff about groups. I think this would be a book that really people would be interested in. Would you be interested in writing a book, not, about my own research, but about the field of group dynamics and what we can do with that to get more out of our groups in life and at work? And I thought about that for a while and thought it sounded like a great idea, especially not to write a book that was really focused just on me and the work I've done, but all the terrific work that's been done over decades about groups and teams and how we can make them more effective. So that's how I came to do this. And that, as Janice was saying, I had a pretty typical background for a PhD student in organizational behavior and a business school professor, which is that I was a professional jazz musician. Most notably, if anyone had heard of the Eder Orchestra, I played with them for 8-9 years. Got to go all over the world, but that I was obviously a little bit of an academic guy. I liked to read and write and think and talk about ideas. And as I was working on my master's degree, I came across the work of this woman named Teresa Amabile, who was studying the social psychology of creativity. And it got me interested in this question of under what conditions can groups improvise creatively? And so I looked up Teresa and where she was, and it turned out she was in this field called organizational behavior at this school called Harvard. And I thought, well, what the heck, I'll propose this idea of studying the conditions under which groups can improvise creatively to work with her. And I applied, and to my surprise, they interviewed me. So actually, Harvard is the only PhD program I was admitted to. No one else thought this was quite as good an idea. And back then, the internet really wasn't what it is today. So I didn't realize I had to know who was in the psychology department. So that when they took me on my interview, they said, "Oh, you're going to meet with this man in the psychology department, Richard Hackman." And I had never heard of Richard Hackman. I didn't really know much about this field, but I met with Richard, and he was really interested in this question: under what conditions can groups improvise creatively? And I didn't know this, but he had written a whole paper about how the way we should ask our research questions is to preface it with under what conditions. And that, questions of does X cause Y, if we do more of this, will we get more of that, are inherently going to be limited in the kinds of discoveries you can make. And so I had kind of intuitively picked up on the way he wanted to think about groups. And that he was also very interested in music. He had studied symphony orchestras. He was an amateur trombone player. So we connected right away. And that this brought me into the wild and wonderful world of trying to understand group dynamics. Now, part of Richard's perspective was one that's not groups are wonderful and groups are good for everything. That probably his most famous quote is, "I have no question that when you have a team, the possibility exists it will generate magic, but producing something extraordinary. But don't count on it." And so Richard, he had a healthy skepticism about the power and potential of groups, that recognizing that we need groups to do much of the important work in the world, that we need teamwork to have the fabulous music and sports and culture that we have, but that in most work teams, we don't see this magic, that we don't see this extraordinary power that they have, and that in fact, a lot of people, when you say we're doing group work, they kind of roll their eyes and they, recoil as this from being something that's going to be enjoyable. In fact, one of Richard's books, it was supposed to be called Groups That Work, being a play on, work teams and also groups that function well. But that so many of the cases that they collected for this book were about ineffective groups, that he ended up calling it Groups That Work and Those That Don't. So getting groups right is really tough. And that, I'm sure I don't have to tell you guys this. And that one particular tough group came in a project that Richard was doing when I was a PhD student. And he was working with Anita Woolley, who was a postdoc at the time, who's now a fabulous professor at Carnegie Mellon, who's pioneered this concept called collective intelligence. But at the time, they were working with U.S. intelligence agencies, kind of in the post 9/11 world, where the government really wanted to get these intelligence agencies to work in cross-functional teams, where we were taking, a person from each different agency to try and synthesize intelligence. And that as part of that, Richard and Anita got a chance to train the leader who was going to pioneer the first of these cross-agency intelligence teams. And this leader, he was very enthusiastic. He read Richard's book, Leading Teams. He knew it front to back. He knew exactly what the theory was and what he was supposed to do. And he went in to actually work with the team and just had terrible timing. That he could not read the team. He was trying to introduce concepts when the team wasn't ready for it and wasn't receptive to what he was proposing. And so Richard and Anita came back from this experience and to our research group asked, what do we know about timing? What do we know about this idea of when groups are going to be ready to receive these interventions and this coaching? And I had come there, like I said, to study improvisation. And to me, this was actually a very similar question. That this question of timing, of reading a group in real time and figuring out, when you're going to act and when you're going to intervene, to me, that was very close to the improvisation I had come there to study. So I wrote up a proposal to say, hey, I don't think we know very much about this, and I think we should learn more. And so I took on this question of when teams are ready for coaching, and that actually was my doctoral dissertation, the timing and type of team coaching interventions. But what we meant by team coaching intervention isn't necessarily what external coaches are doing, but what anyone, a leader, someone else in the organization is doing to try and help improve the process by which a team is working. Now, one of the questions that I think is interesting is to get at people's kind of lay theories of how you actually improve team's effectiveness and group process. And so I want you to just think about what your clients think they should do first to improve their group's effectiveness. And that some of the common answers that come up are, trying to improve group process and communication processes, to deepen trust and interpersonal relationships, to strengthen the group structure, composition, goals, tasks, and norms, or to appoint a stronger leader. And if you guys want to share in the chat which you think your clients would pick most, yeah, we can do that, and I'll just do... Yeah, a lot of B's, the few A's. Yeah, so we're seeing predominantly A's and B's first, and that's great. That's very much consistent with what we actually find when we ask this question. And so one of my favorite studies of this was actually done right here. So right now I'm in Seattle. I'm at the University of Washington. And Michael Johnson, who's a professor here, and his colleagues did a study where they gave business school students basically the same question. They gave a case of a team that was, it had conflict, it had structural problems, it had, almost anything wrong with it that you could imagine. And they asked these students, what do you think you should do first? Which lever should we pull to get started on fixing this dysfunctional team? And the data was really clear that people do have a lay theory about how to do this. And that 84% of the people in this study said we should change the group's process. We should work on the communication processes. We should address the conflict that's in the room. 16% said we should actually, kick some people off the team, bring some new people on the team. And only 5% said that we should try and alter the team's structure. So this is pretty clear data that people, have an idea about what we should do when we're trying to fix dysfunction. And it turns out that this idea is almost entirely backwards. And that's it's a great thing if you're a researcher. It's not a great thing if you're trying to help people improve their teams. So this question, what should we actually do first? Should we work on the structure of our team? Or should we work on the process by coaching the team? It is one that motivated a lot of Ruth Wageman, who is also one of my mentors and on my dissertation committee, and one of my fabulous co-authors over the years, that she took on in her research. And that my favorite study of this is a study she did with Xerox Corporation. So Xerox had a period where they transitioned their technicians to self-managing teams. And that Ruth got a fabulous opportunity to collect data about the external leadership of these self-managing teams. And that as my children were rewatching The Office for the 100th time during the pandemic, I realized that in the TV show, the US version of The Office, at the end, it is in fact a photocopier company in seasons 9 and 10. And the people in Ruth's study were regional managers like Andy Bernard at the end or Michael Scott. And that, like, if you've ever seen The Office, like Andy Bernard and Michael Scott, these external leaders varied in their skill with coaching the team. Some of them did really positive things when they were offering help and support and encouraging self-management, helping the team to clarify its problems and its goals. But a lot of them did actually actively unhelpful coaching. And that negative coaching behavior was often abusive supervision, where they were yelling at people and belittling them, or micromanagement, where they were doing work on behalf of the team and kind of taking away the team's agency. And so the question was, how did this interact with interventions to improve the structure of the team? And so what Ruth found was that for well-structured teams, and I'll talk more about what we mean by that in a moment, but teams that had clear goals, tasks that were well-suited to teams, and were well-composed, those teams benefited from positive leader coaching. So we see the improvement that we would expect from people who are doing what the textbooks say you should do to coach a team. Well-structured teams benefit. But the poorly structured teams really didn't benefit from positive coaching. That they, basically stayed at the same level. They improved a teeny bit, but not statistically significantly. And you can also see, of course, that the well-structured teams just have an advantage over the poorly structured teams regardless. And the reverse is true for negative leader coaching. So the well-structured teams, they were hurt by micromanagement and abusive supervision, but they weren't hurt nearly as much as the poorly structured teams. And that really the negative effects of these negative coaching behaviors are borne almost entirely by the poorly structured teams. So this is a situation where the interaction between structure and coaching shows that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that the lesson from this is really, when you're trying to improve team performance, you should do the opposite of what people's lay theory was saying. You should really attend to structure first, because only when we have a supportive structure for the team, by which I mean its composition is diverse and relatively small, 3 to 6 members, got clear, important, and challenging goals. It has tasks that are well designed and norms that facilitate cooperation and coordination. Only when we get that right does coaching actually have a positive effect. And so this is like what Richard used to say. There's this Far Side cartoon where you have to remember first pants, then your shoes. And that when you're trying to turn to improving process first, as people were in that study, then it's like you're putting your shoes on first and then trying to put the pants on later. And that's just a much harder job. So the first lesson about when teams are ready for coaching is that they're ready for coaching when their structure is strong. But that when you're trying to coach poorly designed teams, it's like you're playing a rigged game at a casino, that when the structure of the game is stacked against you, even if you win for a short period of time, it's likely that the team's going to bounce back to its status quo once you go away. So that's one answer to this question of when are teams ready for coaching, and they're ready for coaching once their structure allows them to be. And what that's led Ruth, Richard, and I to develop is what we call the 60-30-10 rule. And the 60-30-10 rule roughly corresponds to how much of team performance, what percentage of the variation in team performance is affected by each of these elements. So the structure of a group determines about 60% of how effective a team is going to be. And most of structure is actually set before the team ever exists. So this puts a lot of pressure on leaders to think really carefully about how they structure their team even before it meets. And it also, as people who are trying to coach or help teams, it puts more emphasis on us asking people to really carefully reflect on their choices and their analysis of the team situation before they go into that first meeting. But then what I think the most surprising thing to most people is how influential that first meeting really is. And that a team having a shared sense of purpose, a shared goal, a shared direction, and having clear norms for how to behave, those things take root in that very first meeting, and that they are surprisingly sticky. And I think that's one of the things that was the biggest surprise coming out of this research, that what happens in that first meeting determines about 30% of the variation in team performance. And that, we can all imagine teams we've been a part of where we make decisions about how much we're going to be engaged with the team, how committed we're going to be to it, and even how much we're going to speak and contribute in that first meeting. And that if you just watch first meetings of teams, you'll know very quickly, is this a team where everybody's going to speak up, or is one person going to dominate and a few people are going to hang back and really not engage? We can tell a great deal about that just by watching the very first meeting. And so launches are about half as powerful as structure before, but still very powerful. And the truth is that only about 10% of the variation in team performance is shaped by coaching and direct interventions into the process. So the stuff that happens during. Now, that's not to say that coaching's not important. I wrote my whole dissertation on this. I devote a lot of my life to studying interventions to help teams process. And if we could improve teams 10%, that's a huge accomplishment. That's a huge win for a lot of us. But the mistake is to invest in coaching, but not invest in the other 90% of what shapes team effectiveness. So, I'm not going to show this because I know that we want to save a lot of time for questions, but I don't know if you guys remember there was an American Airlines team advertisement a while back about team building, which had things like, putting on a hat that says honesty, pretending that we have human chess pieces, and doing all these kind of stereotypical team building activities that a lot of people are skeptical of, and actually with good reason. And that I think the kind of team building ethos that has grown up in the years was based on some assumptions that turned out not to be that well supported by research. And I don't know if you guys know Bruce Tuckman and his model, but that I essentially blame him for the way the team building activities have grown up. So Tuckman, if you haven't heard his model, that he proposes that groups go through these stages of development: forming, storming, norming, performing, and he later added adjoining. And I think one deep lesson of this is that models that rhyme have amazing staying power. There actually has been research on this since then, that people perceive things that rhyme to be more true than things that don't rhyme. Now, I don't want to completely bash Tuckman, because it's not that this model is wrong. It's just that this model is limited in the kinds of groups that it applies to. So Tuckman developed this model as part of his research into training groups post-World War II, which were referred to as T groups. And that in these T groups, what would happen is they get these veterans coming back from the war, and they were trying to train them for largely leadership positions and other kinds of careers. And the method that they would use was that they'd gather them in a room, and the facilitator would kind of stand off to the side in a corner and wouldn't say anything. And so all these military veterans were gathering in this room, and they're kind of looking at the facilitator, looking at each other, going, what's going on? Eventually somebody would say, hey, aren't you supposed to be doing something? And then somebody else would say, no, this is part of it. And they'd start arguing. And then eventually they would realize, oh, this is part of it. This is how this is supposed to work. And then the facilitator would come in and say, okay, now you guys have taken responsibility for your own learning here. Now we can get to work. And you can see how, if you study those T groups, you would think these are the stages that groups go through. But what we found in subsequent research is that this model applies best to groups that are the clients of their own work. In other words, things like therapy groups, training groups, social groups, they're more likely to mimic Tuckman's model. But groups that have a deadline and a clear task don't really evolve in the same way. And that one of the lessons that I think people are wrong about this is that this, Tuckman's not saying we need trust first to collaborate, but that's really the lesson that people have taken away from this. And that came out in the study and the questions that we were asking. And so, of course, we need to have a kind of trust in one another to collaborate, but that there's two flavors of trust. And that the one big flavor is what we call relational trust or socio-emotional trust, which means I trust you with my deepest, darkest secrets. I believe that you have my best interests at heart. And it's a kind of trust we have in romantic relationships, among friends and family. But there's also instrumental or task-based trust, which means if I ask you to do a piece of work, I believe that you will do it effectively and in the way that you had said. And that, when we kind of conflate these two things, we end up doing a lot of team building that's aimed at socio-emotional trust, but we don't invest very much in task-based trust. And the reality of building a team and the interventions that are most effective in doing that have people actually start collaborating in order to build task-based trust. So the only way that you know that somebody is going to do the task well and do it the way they said they're going to do it is to see them do it. And so we have to kind of build build instrumental trust as we collaborate. And the great meta-analysis by Eduardo Salas at the University of Central Florida showed that the more high fidelity the simulations were that you were using to try and build a team, so the closer it was to the real work, the better the team performs in the long run. And that's why we see organizations that have a lot of high stakes teamwork, like the military, like sports organizations. They have things that are more like training camp, where they do the actual task, kind of practice versions of the task. And that's how they build this kind of trust, rather than putting on a trust hat and talking about their deepest, darkest secrets. That's not to say that's bad. It's just less effective. So now, instead of thinking about team development as this gradual development through which we build up trust and relationships, what actually happens is what one of Richard's students, Connie Gersick, came up with, what she calls a punctuated equilibrium model of group development. Punctuated equilibrium is a concept from evolutionary biology, also used in physics, and that it describes systems where they go through long periods of relative stasis and then small periods of sudden change. And the groups do this, again, right at the launch. We see norms form very quickly. We see the patterns of effort and coordination and engagement form. And those tend to be pretty static until about halfway through the task. And then what happens is people look up at the clock or the calendar and they go, oh my God, half the time is gone. We better change what we're doing. And that the group gets way, more receptive to change at this point. And then they kind of refreeze into a new pattern that lasts until just before the end. And then most groups right around the deadline have another period of radical change that goes till the end of that task. Now, the lessons from this model are not that group development is this gradual linear progression, but the group process actually coalesces very quickly and it changes infrequently. And that teams are remarkably impervious to intervention, made during times of low readiness, these phase 1 and phase 2, that seek to alter their established trajectories. Now, what Ruth, Richard, and I have done then is to talk about these 3 points of change, the launch, the midpoint, and the end, when teams are naturally more receptive to change, and to say the kind of coaching functions that are most likely to resonate with the team at that moment. And so usually at the beginning, at launch, the performance process we're most concerned about is engaging people and so that they're going to apply sufficient effort to the task. And so coaching functions that are mostly motivational in nature, they're clarifying the goal, they're clarifying it's important, that are getting people excited about that importance and challenge that they're going to be working on, are most effective. And that at the midpoint, at this point where we're looking up at the clock and calendar and going, oh my God, we have to change, now we have some task relevant experience already, and that we can reflect on what we've been doing that's working, what we've been doing that's not working, and what we should do going forward. And these kinds of, start, stop, continue kind of interventions to work on the strategy that the group is using tend to be most aligned with what people are naturally thinking about around the midpoint of any task. And that at the end, once the pressure is off, to debrief what we've done and to invest in building new skills, at learning from one another, and improving our capacity both as individuals and as a team, that's most aligned with what we're thinking about at these end times. So, if we want kind of a framework to think about when teams are ready for what kind of intervention, this is what we think is the most research-based way to think about how to distribute those interventions over time. So this second lesson about when teams are ready for coaching interventions is that they're most ready for coaching at launch, at the temporal midpoint of a task, and at the end. But that coaching interventions just don't have that same impact when you're dealing with a team that's not ready for it. Now, a lot of people, find this helpful, but also, they don't have a launch, midpoint, or an end at the time that they feel like they need change. And so something that I try and encourage leaders to do is to think about the fact that launches, midpoints, and ends are not states of nature. They're not objective features of any task. They're decisions that we make about how to segment the work that we're doing. And so if you feel like you don't have enough of these times of change, what you can do is you can segment your tasks more narrowly, and you can create more launches, midpoints, and ends. And that if you're really working with a team that needs a real fresh start, that there's a methodology I call relaunching a team, whereby we're trying to create as much of a sense of newness as we can, to articulate what we're trying to change, and that usually those are making sure we're aligned on our goals and that we have norms that are facilitating our shared work, and that we're trying to fix those things at that point. And that often means meeting in a new room, facilitating the meeting in a different way, changing as much as you can to create this sense of newness that creates more receptivity for change in teams. So in the book, I have much more to say about how we can help teams to work, but that the system of trying to improve the process of a team through coaching works in tandem with understanding its structure. And so to really have, a team-based perspective on work effectiveness, we need to think about the relationship between structure and process, and to take advantage of these moments when coaching teams are most receptive for coaching. So I can share this sometime later, but Ruth, Richard, and I, and also others have done a lot of work on these topics. Here's some of the actual work, but a lot of what I said today is in this first article in Organizational Dynamics, as well as in the book, if you want more detail on that. And that I'd love to hear your questions. And if you want to stay in touch, Substack newsletter, LinkedIn are the two best ways. And of course, please, I'd love for you guys to read the book if you get a chance. So with that, I would love to take your questions and hear what you guys are curious about from what I've said.
Thank you, Colin. That was great. And there are definitely new things in there that I did not realize. So thank you so much. And I have not read your book. I've listened to your book, which I love.
Oh, thank you. That's good. It's also me. There's not too many, I tell my students, there's not too many times the professor will offer to read the book to you, but I will literally read the book to you if you get the audiobook.
So, and I loved it. So it was great.
Oh, thank you.
Please, anyone who wishes to ask a question, please do so. Mr. Sibley.
Thank you so much for this. Since structure is so important, I'd be really curious to hear first, so how do you evaluate structure? Secondly, if it's about how people are participating in the group, is there a role potentially for individual coaching rather than just switching the person out?
In a way, the whole book is about the diagnostics for structure. Well, not the whole book, but probably 2/3 of the book are about this. But the quick version is, you're evaluating goals in terms of whether we have a shared sense of, what the outcome is, why it's important, and what's going to be challenging about it. And this kind of clear, challenging, consequential rubric is what we're looking for. But that and that this can evolve, out of a social process where we discuss it with the whole team, or it can be, a little bit more of a top-down process. But I think it works best when, a leader reflects on, have I articulated my view of what the goal is, what's important about it, and what's challenging? And have I offered that to the group to make sure that my understanding aligns with their understanding? So that's with the goals. With the tasks, it's a little bit longer list, but that the things I think go wrong with tasks too often are either we're essentially giving a group a task an individual could do for political reasons. And so the question is, do we really need diverse inputs and knowledge and skills into this group? Does it have enough facets to it that it really is a collective task? And the other important thing that I see go wrong a lot is groups that don't have autonomy over how to achieve the goal. So when we think about autonomy, it's not always great to give groups complete autonomy over what their goal should be. So there's some situations that can work, but that often we need some direction on why is this group exist? Somebody assembled us for some purpose, but that we do need autonomy over the process. And that as soon as we deprive groups of autonomy over that process, that then when things go wrong, it's the fault of whoever designed this process. It's not, and the groups no longer experience accountability and responsibility for the tasks themselves. And then, so that's two of them. Composition, quick, small. Most groups are too big. If you've got 10 people, 15 people in a room, and you've got an hour-long meeting, you're not going to hear from everybody. That's just not going to work. So we recommend 3 to 7 members for groups. If you have a bigger group, you want to subdivide for specific tasks, and that we're bounded, interdependent, have diverse knowledge and skills. So I could go on about this for like 30 hours. So, but that there are sort of like specific rubrics for each of these things, and that it does take kind of careful thought about each dimension, because any one of them, unfortunately, can start to undermine the effectiveness of the team.
Okay, so it's very much in the 16 conditions framework.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. That's basically what I'm selling. There's slightly there's slight updates and differences, but broadly speaking, that framework has stood the test of time.
Okay, I will still read your
Yeah.
book. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
You'll love it, Jonathan. Seriously.
Yeah.
All right, Emriel, and then we'll go to Chuck and then Alexander. And I think, unfortunately, that might be all we have time for.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Colin. Thanks for the lovely
Yeah.
book. It's incredible. I've
Oh, thank you.
just reading the book, I really got to understand how much structure made such a pivotal part of it. I was so wondering about all the groups I've coached, why they were just not shifting and moving. But so anyway, the question I have is around goals. I find that C-suite or teams struggle to set goals because they believe their goals are just the organizational goals. We have this. How do you work with that? What's your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the irony, of course, is that some of the worst structured teams and organizations are the senior leadership teams. That they are the most likely to not even know how many members there are. So Ruth did a study with the Hay Group and they asked senior leadership teams, a simple question: how many people are on your senior leadership team? Only 7% of senior leadership teams agreed on how many members the team had. 93% disagreed. So there's very basic things but it does come back to goals, and I think you're absolutely right to hone in on that. That what is the senior leadership team for? And that is something that a CEO, again, I think it works well when a CEO says, here's my understanding of what I'm hoping this team is going to be for. What do you guys think? How does that match? And that if they haven't had that conversation, it's very difficult. But I will say I think there's really tricky things with both senior leadership teams and boards of directors, which is often CEOs don't want those teams to be effective, and that they're by design a little vague, because I think a lot of CEOs feel like that helps them keep more power by kind of disempowering their senior leadership team and their board. And so they intentionally structure them in ambiguous ways. They keep it hard to understand what, what the team is for. And so this is, I think Jonathan's point, like if we need to think about individual coaching, if we have a really powerful person over the structure of this team and they're not bought in to what the value of this team is, they have a lot of levers they can pull to keep this team ineffective if that's kind of secret, in their shadow interests. And so you do need to make sure that you have a CEO who's bought in to it's valuable for me to have an effective senior leadership team. That's not going to take away from my power. That's going to contribute to me being effective, to me, helping this organization. And if they're not bought into that, then I feel like, we end up having the same conversations over and over again. It's like, hey, it would be way better if you clarified the purpose, if you made this team smaller. And they're like, no, I could do that, but it's because they have this kind of theory that that's going to take away from their own control by having a more effective team. So it's a tough problem. It's a common problem. You are not alone in finding this. I think the evidence shows that they are, some of the most dysfunctional, confused teams that I've seen in working with these, in part because they don't inherently have a clear task and they have to define that.
Exactly. Thank you. So, Chuck, you are next, my friend.
Okay. I guess I'm wondering, I don't see any mention of all the other research that's gone into, Lencioni, GE's GRPI, Action Learning, the Aristotle Project, the new ICF team coaching, and people like Ernie Turner who are teaching team coach. It always concerns me about academics is we sort of burrow into on what we find, but we generally don't, except for the Tuckman model, which is, decades old. I don't see any, and I got to read the book. And I think what you've done is absolutely brilliant. But I'm just wondering, does your book talk about any of these the sources of insight and wisdom about team formation, team coaching, etc.?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's got hundreds and hundreds of references, and that some of the things you mentioned, I don't think it's good for us to be in the business of saying what we think is right or wrong with every other model. Of the things you mentioned, Project Aristotle essentially rediscovers what Amy Edmondson had discovered 30 years earlier, which is very central to what what's in the book and what I'm talking about with psychological safety. And that I would say some of the models that you've mentioned are focused on what I would call what there's a real audience for. So I mean, so I said I wouldn't pick on it, but I'll pick on the five dysfunctions of a team for a second. So when I say people have a lay theory that the first thing they want to pay attention to is process, that like to me that book plays very much into that natural tendency to want to hear about what's going on in process. And I'm not saying he's wrong about things that go on in process. It's just what more systematic research has found, these weren't very scientific studies, and that they weren't looking at the kind of relative importance of these things, and it's just a less effective lever to pull. And to me it gets all people's attention focused on what they want to focus their attention on, which unfortunately is the least powerful of the things to focus on. And so I think these I'm hoping that, because this is I'm fundamentally, as you say, a social scientist. I'm not out there in the world of practice doing this every day, and all I can tell you is when we study not tens of teams but thousands, and in many cases hundreds of thousands of teams, this is what works on average, and all research will ever tell you is what works on average. Is that what's going to work in your situation? I don't know, right? Like, you guys are experts in your own situation much more than I am. But that if I was a betting person, I would bet on the things that have worked over hundreds of thousands of iterations and careful scientific research, over people who are kind of relying on the vibes of their own experience as they think this stuff through. And that because teams have this, the reason I brought up that lay theory thing at the beginning is that people naturally want an explanation that says, hey, I've got like these two people in the team who are fighting, and I want to hear that they have different conflict styles, and I want to work on that. And it's not, again, to say that that's wrong. It's just to say if that's all you do and you don't pay attention to the rest of it, you're probably not going to succeed, according to the research that we've had on this.
Mhm. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Colin. So, Alexander, last question to you, but just want to share with you, Colin, our vibes totally align.
Yes.
So the center of our team wheel is common purpose, shared goals.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
absolutely the center of all of our teams. Not that all of our clients want to go there all the time.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah.
But that's center focus for us. Alexander.
Yeah, so thank you, Colin. This was wonderful. I want to acknowledge you for your work and your style and who you are. It's just there's so much matching here. There's some differences, but there's so much matching. So it makes my heart content and happy. And the question I have for you is this: we do work with a lot of those executive teams, executive leadership team, executive management team, senior leadership team, on top of organizations who have been around for a long, long, long time, and whose structure is off, and it's not fixable, where it won't be fixed or something's there. So yeah, there's common purpose and shared goals and roles and compositions, all that work. But I'm particularly interested in the Gersic model, punctual equilibrium model. Were you saying that an executive leadership team could engage in an initiative, a program, a task, a strategy that would have beginning and end, and then you'd be able to come in at those 3 points for that particular initiative? Is this? I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying.
Yes, absolutely. So, like, I think the lesson to take away from the Gersic model as somebody who's trying to, help and coach teams is that creating this sense of beginnings, middles, and ends is,
Right.
our most powerful lever for creating more receptivity to change.
Okay.
And that often those moments create, like we should be revisiting our goals and revisiting our norms at launch, regardless of what they are. They are, and that creating these sense of tasks, especially if the thing about team design that's a little bit flawed is the composition of the team. So we've got, a 30-person senior leadership team or whatever we've got, that creating a task and then saying, all right, we're not all going to be equally accountable for this, right? Like not all 30 of us are going to do all parts of this. Let's have a smaller task force that is better composed for this task take responsibility for that. And I think, at least I'm sure you guys have experienced this, but like in my experience with this, the resistance you get is when at the beginning people don't trust that they're going to get their own input into important decisions, and so they don't like subsets because it feels like they're not gonna have this input here. And so it does take a lot of building trust that you're going to get your opportunities to have input in whatever this team comes up with, and you're going to get your turn on important task forces. But that if we're going to be more effective as, if you're a 30-person senior leadership team, you're already like a small organization. If we're going to be more effective as this organization that is the senior leadership team, we're going to have to start to
Right.
have more effective groups within that. And that to me is the tough barrier that often I find takes a long time for senior leadership teams to buy into.
And that drives right into Anita Woolley's work that broader participation increases collective intelligence.
Yep.
Yeah.
We want to have participation, but again, it doesn't work that well when it's 30, right? Like
Right,
it's,
right, right, right.
that research really applies best when we're talking about, groups smaller than 10.
Right. Thank you, Colin.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Great. And so I ask everyone to come off mute and give Colin a round of applause. And thank you so
Thank you.
much. It's been,
Thank you,
Colin.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Colin. It was
you.
great, Colin.
Thanks.
It was
Oh, thank you.
fantastic. Thank you, Colin.
We'll read the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
you.
Thank
The
you.
book
Thank
is
you.
excellent.
you.
And listening to it is great. I feel like,
Thank you so much.
so many great nuggets, so many things that align and make us feel good about what we're doing, and a lot of new stuff too. So perfect. So thank you, Colin.
Great.
Appreciate you. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Yes.
Enjoy April. May it be a good month for all, and enjoy your weekend, everybody.